Hey, what's going on, guys? So this is a very requested breakdown that I've been getting, and it's pitcher Clayton Andrews. He actually recently had a call up to the big leagues up with the Brewers, and he's kind of, bouncing back and forth right now. But the reason that he's been getting so much interest is because he's listed at 5'6", 160 pounds, but he's been up to, 96, touching 97 miles an hour. And so obviously seeing velocity like this, there haven't been a ton of guys throwing these types of velocities from that small of a frame. Obviously Stroman comes to mind, but Stroman a couple inches taller. I think back to Tim Collins, right? That's really the main comp I can think of from years ago. Also being able to generate a ton of power from a smaller frame, but kind of begs the question, how is he able to do this? And I think it just in general, undersized pitchers who are throwing 95 plus are just a great display of efficiency and a great kind of study in terms of how the body actually produces velocity and really what's possible. I've seen guys that are 6'10" that can't throw 97 miles an hour. So first things first, a little bit of background on him. He was a two-way player through 2019, stud player through college as an outfielder pitcher, ultimately drafted 2017 and then again 2018, I believe, and he was a two-way player through 2019 and then, kind of converted to focusing on pitching. Generally, very athletic. We don't train him currently, but he was willing to get on a phone call and kind of talk through some of my questions, which was super awesome and super helpful. But he mentioned that he played everything growing up. He played pretty much every sport, but competitively, he focused on baseball and basketball. He hasn't always thrown this hard, so he was more 88, 90, 91, touching 92 type range through college and kind of earlier on in his pro career. But he actually had Tommy John surgery, and it wasn't until after that rehab that he really started pumping, mid 90s more consistently. And so we'll talk about that as we get into the breakdown and some of the lifting metrics and kind of what he relayed to me as his weight room focus and some of the metrics that he's gotten to. But let's just dive right into the mechanics. One thing worth pointing out is with shorter guys, like so many other things need to go right in order to throw hard. But there's less room for error, right? You can't be some guy who's just like a 6'7" physical specimen, right? Maybe doesn't have to transfer energy that efficiently through their body to just take advantage of the leverages and the momentum, which comes easier to them, right? So they have to be efficient in a lot of different ways. One thing to point out as well is the lever lengths are kind of tough. Like we don't really know what his leverages are that he's dealing with. We kind of know, listed at 5'6", but what is his wingspan, right? His wingspan might be 5'10", right? Might just be a little bit below average. His wingspan might be 5'5", like way below average. So, you could tell he doesn't have a crazy long wingspan. His arms are proportional to his height, but again, just worth pointing out because there are going to be, I have played with guys who are 5'10", but they have 6'3", 6'4" wingspans, and guys who are 6'5" who have 6'3" wingspans. And so it can be a little bit difficult to discern the true leverages when we just use height as kind of a proxy for levers. This isn't what he's directly thinking on the mound, but he said, if I had to put words to kind of like what I'm feeling at each phase of the delivery, this is what I would do. And he said, phase 1, lift. Phase 2, balance. And we'll talk about that, whether, balance may or may not be the best term for everybody to think, but he says lift, balance, sink, power, flow, explode. So again, lift, balance, sink, power, flow, explode. So we're going to get into kind of like what I think he's specifically referencing through each piece of that. But let's just kind of start with set position, walk through the delivery kind of one step at a time. He starts off in kind of already a little bit of a counter rotated position. You can see he's coming set a little bit cross body. And then as he lifts, he's counter rotating, he's torquing, he's turning even more on that back leg. And so I asked him about this. I asked if this is something that's kind of intentional. And he says this has evolved more as he's tried to be deceptive, right? Trying to get batters out, be able to do more with less. And so this move, you can see he's keeping the hands close to the body. You can see, he's really counter-rotating the trunk and trying to hide the ball. And that's exactly what he told me he's been trying to do, is trying to hide the ball, trying to stop anybody from being able to see it in the glove. And that he's kind of continued to tinker a little bit with this over the last couple of years. As he gets into his leg lift, you can see there's definitely some aspect of drift. So even though in his mind he's thinking balance, one of the things that I asked him about was, have you ever kind of felt yourself over drift, right? Where the center mass gets going forward too fast, the tempo is too fast, the upper half gets going way out in front of the back leg. And he said yes. So for him, he's not necessarily thinking about drifting because that part comes really naturally to him. And so in his case, he thinks a lot more about trying to feel balance, trying to feel his backside, and trying to feel, as I kind of describe on the channel a lot, this feeling of like strength or feeling weight acceptance through the back leg. So this would typically kind of correspond to head over the back hip, and having your center of mass over that back hip is typically going to be that feeling of strength, that feeling of strong backside, of not losing the backside as you move forward down the mount. It's just when that head starts to get out over the front hip that guys start to feel like they're losing the backside. They lose that stability or that strength or that balance as they move forward. And so for him, he needs to think balance. But one of the things that we talked about was, because again, he still has kind of what I would consider pretty much a sweet spot of that amount of drift. He's still drifting like 3, 4, 5 inches. He's able to get things going, still drop into the backside, still get back, still sequence everything and get on time by the time he gets to landing and into ball release. But we talked a little bit about, have you ever at any point in your career felt the opposite side of that continuum, where maybe you stayed a little bit too far back and your shoulders tipped way uphill and you actually did truly come to a balance point and your tempo was way too slow. And so we talked about that, and he said, it's funny you say that. Like I felt both extremes, right? I felt when my tempo was way too slow and I was truly coming to this balance point over the rubber, tipping uphill, and things were too slow. And then I've also felt what it's like to speed it up too much, to overdrift, to feel my upper half getting out front of the lower half. And so, he kind of agreed with this idea of there being a sweet spot. But again, for him, he has to think more balance, and it brings him back to that sweet spot of drift. Whereas somebody that's already really stuck over the rubber, if they think balance, that's not going to work for them. They might have to think more aggressive drift to find that sweet spot. So again, just using cues to exaggerate the pieces that are most relevant for you. Talking about the glove tap. So I asked him about his kind of timing mechanisms and where he felt like he got his rhythm from. And to no one's surprise, likely who's been watching this channel for any amount of time, he mentioned the glove tap was something that he feels really is helpful for rhythm. And so you can see, separating his hands, separating the ball from the glove pretty early as he lifts his leg, and then using that tap to kind of cue the start of his arm action and the start of his sit into the back leg. So he said the glove tap is his cue to sit into the back leg. So I just thought that was interesting, not particularly unique. A lot of guys do that, but again, just worth pointing out that when you see these really explosive, high rhythm, high tempo deliveries, a lot of these guys have glove taps. A lot of these guys have that aggressive hip to finish recoil. There's a lot of similarities between these guys. And so it's just worth taking note. Right? If you're struggling with the rhythm, if you're struggling to feel how the arm action, the upper half, the lower half all kind of fit together into this one fluid wave of energy, this one dance move, maybe you're feeling a little bit robotic, you're feeling like your mechanics are, there are a bunch of pieces moving independently. They don't all kind of unify together into one fluid motion. And you haven't tried the glove tap, you haven't tried playing with the windup, you haven't tried going hands over the head and kind of feeling how these different ideas we talk about. Play with it. Take a bullpen, play with some of these different tools, and see if you can't feel how all these different pieces start to coordinate with each other a little bit better. Again, super common, can be super helpful. He talks a lot about feeling his backside. And so again, just to rehash, he has a little bit of that seesaw effect that we talk about. Head kind of stays over the front hip as he initially shifts, more so over the belt buckle. And then as he drops into his backside, he gets that little bit uphill tilt. His head really shifts back over the back hip. And so he said that his cue has just been backside ever since Tommy John. And that was one of the main things, on top of improving his strength, improving some of his power metrics, that's really helped him feel like his arm is now along for the ride. And it's not simply an arm driven, an upper half driven throw. So it's that position, drifting, and then being able to really find the backside, find that powerful, strong position where the head stays over the back hip, and that kind of sweet spot for him of how much hinge, how much, knee flexion. You can see his knee is not way out over the toe, right? It's relatively in line with the toe. It's not way out in front. Heel is relatively engaged. He's staying really close and loaded with the hips. And so for him, he's more of that internal rotation dominant type pitcher, but sitting in the glute and just really good position right there to feel his back leg. So for him, that's been a huge key. Again, not surprising. That's a big key for a lot of guys. If we look at the arm action, one of the main differences that he says he felt before surgery and after surgery since he started throwing harder was, again, he feels like all the focus is now on the backside, the back leg, holding the backside, holding that tension. Again, all the same things we talk about on the channel, but his arm is now along for the ride. He said his arm follows his body until that explode phase. Whereas before surgery, he kind of felt like he had to create all of that velocity from his arm. Again, I've been there. I felt it both ways, and I couldn't load my backside, torn up hip, torn up back hip, back knee problems, anything like that. Again, the arm begins to become the main engine of the throw, and you just can't pitch that way. You can't sustain it long term. Velocity is not going to be as good. Sustaining velocity deeper into an outing isn't going to be as easy. You get sorer. It's harder to repeat, just for a whole host of reasons. So I've been there for sure, but that was, again, an interesting comment from him. And again, realizing that the arm does come into the throw. It's just about when you bring the arm into the throw, and is it the main driver? Or are you letting the hips be the main driver of the throw and not bringing the arm into the throw until that very last second? And so what is that explode phase? That explode phase is waiting until hips have had their chance to unload. Then the pelvis begins to decelerate. Now the trunk begins to accelerate. Boom. Now the arm begins to come into the throw, and you get that big final pull, that big final like active contraction of the pec, of the lat, of the subscap, of basically that big pull from all the internal rotators and horizontal adductors of that throwing arm at that very last second. But again, the arm staying relaxed, following the lower half until landing, until then you get that big final pulse, big final pull into ball release. We can talk about his separation now. How does he unload into landing? And so he actually holds his posture really well. So he's holding that neutral relationship between the pelvis and between the trunk. So if we think about the pelvis like a bowl or a cylinder, and the thorax of the cylinder having those, stacked, he's holding that stack very well down the mountain. He holds it here, 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 holds it here. At this point, there's really not much separation going on, right? He's just in this loaded torque position on the back hip. Hips are closed, trunk is closed, right? Everything is facing this direction, closed. And his spine is in this stacked position. From here, he allows the hips to begin opening while holding the shoulders back. And so now he starts getting into this separated position. Again, hard to see from video exactly, but you're probably looking in the range of 40 to 50 degrees of separation. So on the higher end of kind of that normal range of separation. So he appears to be almost fully closed with the shoulders, maybe 45, 50 degrees open at landing with the pelvis. And so he's creating a good amount of separation here, especially for having, a little bit of a shorter torso. But again, when it comes to separation, it's not necessarily that more is always better, right? It has to do with your leverages. It has to do with how tight of a rubber band that you're dealing with, right? So we've seen guys that throw 100 that have, 30 degrees of separation. And it's not a ton of separation, but it's really well timed, really well sequenced. They're a tighter guy to begin with. And so for them, that's fully stretching or getting a good, well-timed stretch of a tighter rubber band. You also see guys that have a really, really loose body, really loose torso. And, they might be able to access a lot more range. But again, it's not just about how much of a gap you can open or how much range you can get into at landing. It's also how fast can you close that gap. And so he times this very, very well. He's getting into good amounts of separation, but he cannot only get into the range, he can get out of the range elastically. And so he gets that elastic recoil out of that position and captures it really, really well. So again, separation important, but it's also about the timing of that separation and the sequencing of everything. And again, you'll see he holds that everything closed until the very last second. He's closed, 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 closed. And right about here, he begins to open up at the very last second before landing. You can see where the belt buckle is facing. Hips pop open just before landing. But he's staying sideways. He's holding that closed torque position until the very, very, very last possible second. And then it pops open. Shoulders don't have a chance to get open because it happens so quick. Hips pop open, and that creates this momentary stretch through that entire oblique swing. If we look at how he unloads from there, how he captures that, because that arm is in a good position, right? He's right around 90 degrees of abduction. So his elbow's in line with the shoulders, and his arm is right around 90 degrees of elbow flexion. So he's in a perfect position right here, and he's in a relatively neutral posture from his trunk. He's in a perfect position to actually capture all that momentum and all that power from the lower half and actually transfer it into the arm. If his elbow was down here, if his elbow was up here, if the ball was way out here, if the ball was way in here, he might not be in as good of a position to actually transfer all this momentum into the ball. But he is in a great position. You can see he's got some degree of scap retraction, probably about as good as you're going to get for his type of limb length, his body type. Again, the longer the humerus, the longer the arm. Imagine if his upper arm was significantly longer, was way out here, how far back that ball would be. So guys can look like they're getting way more scap retraction, but it's really just because they have a longer humerus, a longer upper arm bone, that it looks like they're getting way back behind the head. Think Aroldis Chapman, but for him, again, he's just dealing with the levers he's got. So it's not going to look nearly as extreme in terms of the positions he's going to be getting into. As he unwinds, as he gets that big pull, you can see he's accessing 180-ish degrees of layback, give or take a few degrees. And you can see he's unwinding almost perfectly in plane. Shoulders, elbow, ball. He gets that entire unwinding into that same rotational plane. And so he's capturing that tornado of energy from the ground, from fully loaded, torqued power position right here to a fraction of a second later. He's unwound that torso and he's maximally utilized the different elastic, components throughout his entire body while getting everything in plane as well. If we look at the deceleration, we can see he's getting into that kind of Dominican finish, right? The pimp the finish piece of it. And so again, it's not just how much you can open the gap or create a gap or create space or separate. It's how fast can you close the gap, how fast can you decelerate, how well can you slam on the brakes as well. And that's the whip-like mechanism we constantly talk about, right? The whip-like mechanism doesn't just happen from the initial move, right? It happens from the acceleration followed by the abrupt deceleration, and that creates that whip-like mechanism. And so we watch how his pelvis decelerates. Pelvis closed, pelvis pops open aggressively, and then he sticks it. That allows the trunk to begin accelerating, and then the trunk sticks. And then that decelerates and allows the arm to begin to slingshot. So it's this perfect sequence of acceleration, deceleration, acceleration, deceleration, acceleration, deceleration. And then one other thing I didn't mention yet, if we look at his lead foot, you can kind of tell what type of hips he has, just based on his delivery as a whole. But again, landing a little bit more closed, probably landing 25 to 45 degrees closed on that front foot. And so again, that's going to take a good amount of hip internal rotation to pull off. I would not expect, somebody with below average internal rotation to be able to pull off that position. So he's dealing with a lot of range, and that's one of the common subconscious moves that'll happen is just getting that blocking angle a little bit cross body and a little bit closed with that lead foot to maximally take advantage of all the slack that he's got in that hip, just as a result of how much rotation he has available to him. Let's take a second, we'll talk about his metrics real quick, and then we'll talk about some of his lifting and power training and some of the changes he's made. So first things first, metric wise, currently averaging about 14 inches vertical break with his four seam. So a little bit more on the dead zone side with the four seam fastball profile, which again, if he can get that up or he can find a way to get a little bit more outlier with the fastball profile, I think that's going to really help him, especially because he currently works fairly low in the zone with his fastball. Shout out True Media, who we have a subscription with. But again, you can see he's primarily working low in the zone right now. And if we look at how his fastball is playing when he throws one with a little bit higher vert, if we look at the subset of pitches where he's got a higher vert, so over 17 inches of vertical break, again, smaller sample size, but his K percentage over 40%, crazy low WOBA, crazy low FIP, crazy low batting average against, right? And then if we, on the flip side, look at fastballs under 14 inches of vert, right? K percentage much lower, walk percentage much higher, batting average against much higher, FIP, xFIP much higher. So this would be something that if he can find a way to get a little bit more outlier profile, possibly average 16, maybe even 17 vert on the fastball, keep similar velocity, or potentially just throw a little bit harder as well, or potentially play up the vertical approach angle side of things where he's not throwing low in the zone and kind of flattening. His fastball doesn't have the same rising effect when he throws it low in the zone. So he's already going to have a little bit lower release height just because of his stature. And so shorter pitchers really have an opportunity to play that up, to play up the Craig Kimbrell effect, to play up the Josh Hader effect from a little bit lower slot, a little bit lower release height, throwing up in the zone, really start to get above some barrels. And so again, you can see low fastball right there. So again, that's just something potentially for him to consider, is are there some different tools, techniques to try to get slightly higher vert, again, maybe long toss, pull downs, or clean fuego, one option. There's some different options, different cues to try to work on that vert side of it. And then again, just where you're actually utilizing your pitches, and then how you're constructing the overall arsenal and tunneling those pitches off of each other. And then the final thing we can talk about here is the lifting and power training. So one of the things he really spent a ton of time on during that TJ rehab was getting stronger, getting more explosive. And so he told me he took his dumbbell bench from 65s to 85s for his working sets. His squat he took from 225 to 275 or so for his working sets. And he said at this point his relative strength, relative power is towards the top of the team. So he's a fast twitch athletic guy. He can easily grab rim. I didn't clarify if he can dunk or not, but even grabbing rim, very, very explosive for someone at 5'6". And so he's powerful, but I told him honestly, dude, like your strength is still not as high as it could be. There's easily 15-20% more absolute strength in there. I'm not saying he'd gain 4 miles an hour, but I think there's another tick. There might be another tick or two left in his frame, even with as efficient as his mechanics already are. Again, you're starting to just try to tap into every little bit of toothpaste in the tube, right? Any little thing we can do where all of these things added up, maybe that gets us that last 2 miles per hour. And again, if he can be sitting 95, 97 instead of touching 95, 97, if maybe he comes into a season with sitting 16 inches of vert from a low release height, throwing above barrels instead of 14 inches of vert, these can all have a really, really massive effect on the overall product that he puts onto the field. So I think he has more in the tank for sure. Certainly he's made a big transformation, surprised a lot of people, but it'd be really fun to just kind of follow him and see how he continues to progress through his career. So again, we don't work with him. We love the opportunity at some point to be able to help him out if possible. But again, just really cool example of what efficiency can look like despite not having a prototypical pitcher's frame. So hopefully you guys got something out of the video. If you have any questions, drop them down below. If you have any suggestions for future breakdowns, let me know it down below as well. And I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.